how to tank multiple adds. So we're kind of thinking of methods of tanking add pulls, how to tank things when you've got like a lot of ads to deal with, and all that kind of stuff. That is what we're going to kind of cover now. So add pulls are the phase that you have in between, like in dungeons and trials and arenas that happen like between boss fights. So when you've got multiple ads, there's no like bosses, and it's just kind of in between the boss phases. We have add pulls, and during these phases or these areas, you will usually have to deal with a large number of enemies. So sometimes there can be as little as 2 or 3 enemies, and other times you can have up to 10 enemies to deal with at one time. When dealing with multiple enemies, you need to utilize your crowd control. And crowd control is also known in the game as CC. CC skills, CC immunity, all that kind of stuff. In add pulls, you will often not be able to taunt everything. So you need to prioritize elite or dangerous enemies and then use all of your different taunt methods that we've talked about already. And then your crowd control skills as well to stop the enemies from getting to your group. So you utilize all of those things. So the different stuff we talked about earlier about taunting, soft taunts, medium taunts, all that kind of stuff. You've got to utilize it all in add pulls to control all of the enemies into that type space. So the different types of crowd control that are most prominent for us tanks. The first one is snares. Now, snares reduce the movement speed of your enemies. And the way we do this is things like caltrops. The DK's got Cinderstorm. That's a snare. There's a few different skills that snare the enemy, and it reduces the speed at which they move. And these are very useful for crowd control as much as everything else. Snares don't get used as much as immobilizes and chains, but they should, because it really does help speed up the process of controlling a huge pack of enemies. We've then got chains and pull skills, so these pull the enemies towards you and make them taunted to you for a few seconds. We've got skills such as Silver Leash, Unrelenting Grip, and then also the Vatishran Sword and Board and Swarm Mother, things like that. They're chains and pulls. They pull enemies towards you. We've got Immobilizes, which these hold the enemy in place and root them to the ground. So we've got things like Talons, Empowering Grasp, Gripping Shards. You cast them. Some of them are really good. So like Talons is great, 360 degrees. Gripping Shards is great, that's 360 degrees. Empowering Grasp is straight in front of you. There's quite a few different ones that you can use. I think like the Sork's got an Immobilize skill as well. Pretty much everything apart from the Templar and the Necro. No, sorry, Templar and Nightblade have an Immobilize type skill. We've then got Fears. So a fear is like it makes the enemy cower from like the feared from you, and like we've talked about fears already, where they're not as good as an immobilization because the enemy kind of gets scared and hides away from you, and then they can't be chained, or the other way around. If you chain an enemy, they can't be feared. So you have to kind of consider that a little bit. We've got things like Agony Totem on the Necro, Turn Evil from the Fighters Guild, which might be used on a Templar. And then Mass Hysteria as well on the Nightblade. We've got stuns, which frees the enemy on the spot. And a stun is just makes the enemy curl up on the ground, and they're kind of stuck. And things like a time stop. So there are restrictions on crowd control. So you can't keep an enemy permanently crowd controlled. They have like a 6-second immunity to crowd control. So when you chain an enemy and then Talons them, you can't then Talons them again straight after. You used to be able to. You used to be able to Talons the enemy, and as soon as the Talons ended, you cast it again, and they'd go back into Talons. But we do now have a crowd control immunity. So enemies will, for a little period of time, not be able to be crowd controlled again. So you'll have to wait like 6 seconds to be able to Talons that same enemy for a second time. Some things can be applied one after another. To have good crowd control of enemies. Like you can snare an enemy, then you can chain them, then you can immobilize them. So you can make use of like Talons, snares the enemy, reduces their speed by 70%, so they don't even make it to your group. And then you run into them. You use Talons to root them in place on top of your caltrops, and then you chain in the ranged enemies onto your caltrops, so they get chained in, and then they get snared because they go on top of the caltrops, which then snares them. So you've got to think about ways that you can kind of combine different skills and different crowd control things that are going to make you able to crowd control enemies to a better standard. You can't chain an enemy and then stun or fear them. So if you've chained an enemy, stuns and fears won't work. And if you stun and fear an enemy, they can't be chained. So you have to kind of watch out for that kind of stuff, because it just won't work if you try and do those things back to back. There are certain things that just won't work. So this is what makes some classes better at crowd control than others. So the DK chains and talons, the Warden with the frozen device and grip and shards, they work great. They're a good example of crowd control. Bad examples of crowd control: Templars and Nightblades, Silver Leash and Turn Evil and Mass Hysteria. They work really bad. So when you use Silver Leash and then try to use Turn Evil and Mass Hysteria, they don't work. So you can only chain the enemy to you. Another thing to just quickly note there, we have kind of touched on this already, but using the Vateshran Sword and Board is not necessarily a great way of chaining and crowd control, because when you chain the enemies to you, they don't taunt like they do with an actual chain. So Silver Leash and Unrelenting Grip, when you chain those enemies in, they get aggroed to you. When you use the Vateshran Sword and Board, they get pulled in, and then you have to absolutely instantly use a crowd control skill like Talons with the Vateshran Sword and Board, because if you don't, they just all run off in all different directions. So it's a real problem. You have to watch out for that. Yeah, so you've got to play to your class strengths. Templar tank, using a snare is going to be really valuable, because if you're not using a snare, it's going to be really difficult, because the only thing you've got to use is a fear skill. They don't have a built-in class-based skill that's going to immobilize enemies. You have to use Turn Evil, which is a fear. So what you can do is put your caltrops down, you go into the ad pull, you put down your Turn Evil, that fears the enemies near you, you chain the enemies in, they then get snared. You've got to think about the way that you do it. Do you know what I mean? You've got to think about the process that you're going through, because if you try to chain enemies onto your Turn Evil, they're just going to run off again, and they won't get stuck in position. The whole point of pulls and chaining and routing is that you want to stack enemies into as small of a spot as possible, so that your teammates can put their damage in one spot and kill everything in one go. That's the whole point of just smashing through ad pulls, is to stack everything really tight and compact, really close together, and then your group can kill them really, really super fast. So yeah, like we said already, snares, chains and pulls and immobilizers work great together. So try to use those types of skills if you can. So the general process of an ad pull: caltrops at the start, throw it in front of the enemy. Don't throw it on top of them. Throw it like just a little bit in front, so that when the fight starts, they walk into it. You don't want to throw it on top of them, because then they'll walk out of it. So you throw it kind of a little bit in front, so it just hits them a little bit. But then they're going to walk onto the caltrops, and that will keep them snared for a much longer period of time, and they'll kind of get stuck in the middle of it. And that's what you want to happen. And then you would kind of range taunt the most threatening enemies and the melee enemies. So the ranged enemies don't typically need to be taunted as much as the melee targets, because the guys, the sword and board guys, the two-handers, those kind of enemies, they're going to run straight at your group, so those are the ones you're going to want to taunt as a priority. And anything that's got an elite health bar or a boss health bar is obviously going to need to be taunted first. You could also frost blockade as you walk towards an enemy, because that has got an immobilize feature inside of it. So when you put down frost blockade, you can chill the enemy, they will get immobilized. So on things like a Templar, you could use caltrops and then put down blockade as well, and that would be a frost blockade. So you could immobilize enemies, and that's quite good, because immobilizations are better than fears. So that would be quite a good option if you could do that. Immobilize the melee enemies inside the caltrops so they cannot get to your group, and then chain in all the ranged enemies, and then use your immobilize again to hold them in place. So that's kind of the process you go through for an apple. Other methods of tanking ads. So obviously we've got chains, talons, pulling in. We've got line of sight stacking. So we've got line. This is something that most people are a bit lacking in their knowledge of. Is the other types of kind of ad pulls is line of sight stacking is when some enemies cannot be chained. So you use objects in the environment to stack the enemies. And you do this by standing somewhere that the enemies cannot see you unless they stack in a certain way, and they will look to find you, and they will move and stack at a point where you become visible. So for example, you can go and initiate combat with a set of enemies, and then kind of stand in a certain place, and you go and hide in a corner or run backwards a little bit, and the enemies will run at you and try and get to the same point so they can see you. And that way they'll stack up, because if you like hide behind a flower or a plant, let's say you hide behind a tree, so you hide behind a tree, the enemies will try and find you. So they'll run straight for you, and they'll be trying to see where you are. The enemies will then all stack in one spot. They'll always stack in the point where they first see you. So they'll be coming towards you, and then they'll just stay still when you're in their range, and they will stack in that line of sight stack. So line of sight stacking is more of a thing for trials, not really for dungeons, because in trials there are a lot of enemies that cannot be chained. So line of sight stacking is something where you get aggro of a bunch of enemies, and then you hide somewhere or stand somewhere or run backwards to kind of make them chase and follow you to a point where they all stack together really close. You've then got charge stacking. So this is where you kind of run at the enemies and then freeze them in one spot. So there's quite a few situations where this is possible. VHOF is another one. So VHOF is very predominant place to look for line of sight stacking. There's lots of line of sight stacking in Halls of Fabrications. And there's also quite a bit of charge stacking. So charge stacking is where the enemies, you know where they spawn, and you just sprint at them, and you put down an element of blockade, and they just kind of stay still where they are. Because they would usually run towards you, but they'll just kind of stop in their spot, and that means they'll be stacked up. So you can kind of do that in some places too. VHOF is one of them. The ads kind of spawn a little bit further back, and then they move towards you. If you sprint at the ads and put down blockade really quickly, quite often that'll just kind of, not by freeze in place, I don't mean like they get immobilized. What I mean is they will kind of be moving, and then they'll just stop, and they'll freeze, and they'll just be stacked, and they'll try and attack you. So you can do kind of charge stacking quite often in some places, and you just charge them down really quick, and that'll stop the enemies from moving, and then that's already stacked for you. You don't have to worry about line of sighting. You don't have to worry about chaining, because they just charge stacked, because you've sprinted at them so quickly, you've stopped them from getting their movement going or moving into different positions. And then you've got kind of soft aggro, which is another method of tanking ads. And this is where you kind of take a group of enemies away from the group, but you don't need to retaunt them, as you're the only enemy to those ads. And you control them by inflicting damage and creating a soft aggro. So a place where we've done that recently is in Helra. We took all the gargoyles and ran around the entrance, and they will only be soft aggroed to us because we've got aggro of a gargoyle, and we run to the entrance, and then the other people in our group are too far away, so they'll just chase after us, and we'll run around in circles, and they'll just keep following us the whole time. There is a video on that on YouTube if you want to see it, where we've got all 12 gargoyles and they're just chasing us around, so you can see that that kind of soft aggro if you want to on YouTube. So I'm going to give a little bit of a demonstration now on how to kind of tank ad pulls. And there's a few different examples. We kind of go through a few different things of showing you how to deal with different ads. So here we go. Right. So I'm gonna do a talk over of this while it's playing. So this is just generic kind of stuff. So Caltrops in front of the enemies, you run in, and then you just talons them in place. So these enemies ran towards us. This is kind of charge stacking, because these enemies ran at us, and we stacked them. We just ran straight at them. We threw Caltrops down. Here's another one. So Caltrops again. If you look, we place the Caltrops just in front of them. So when the enemies run towards us, they get stuck. So look, Caltrops goes down. The enemies start running, but now they're snared. Look how slow they're moving. Like, this is on slow-mo, but they are really slow. We focus taunt on the ghost, and then we start chaining the ranged enemies in. We've talons the enemies inside the Caltrops, and now we're picking off some taunts. Now we're taunting, and then we've just chained in the enemies, and then we're talons in the new enemies that have just got in, picking off a few taunts, and we just kind of play it that way. So that's, and then we've seen another enemy over there, chain it in. In ad pulls, you don't have to perma block either, so you can kind of, I block like now and again. I don't perma block. I block, wait a second, block, wait, and I keep taking my finger off block. And when I chain, as I chain, it was block chain. And then I kind of just like you see, I'm keeping control of them because I'm keeping down Caltrops. I keep using talons. I keep using blockade. So the things that are happening there is they're getting chilled and immobilized. They're getting talons in place. They're getting snared. So there's no way for them to really move. The ads are stuck because I've got them so well controlled. Here's VHOF now. This is how you do line of sight stacking. So to start with, you'll see charge stacking. So you see here, I've got this enemy, and I run at the ads, And these ads are running up the hill towards me, but I run at the ads and then they get stuck, look. But now I'm going to move them to a different place. So I'm going to show you line of sight stacking here. So I taunt them and I'm going to go and hide behind this mushroom. So I hide behind this mushroom, look, and the ads can't see me. So they both move and then they stack up, look. So that's line of sight stacking. I've gone to a different location. I've hidden behind a mushroom and that's made them stack. Here's another one. So I've got a couple of ads here. They're not quite stacked really closely. They're spread out a little bit. So we taunt them all and we go and we hide in the wall a little bit just there, look, and they all run and move into a stack. That's line of sight stacking. And then there's more ads coming down, look, I've got another one there. There's one at the top of the hill, look. There's an ad all the way at the top of the hill. So we taunt it, we hide in the wall again, and that comes into the stack. So that's line of sight stacking. We kind of taunt the enemies, and we stand somewhere where it forces them to look for us and see us, and then we can get control, and we can force them to stand in a certain place. And here we go again, just another line of sight stacking. We've got some ads. We're running away. This is just kind of running away from them. We just run away from them. And then when you've got multiple enemies taunted and you run away, what happens is if they're in different directions, you can kind of run away and they kind of go into a V shape. And that's kind of what you're looking out for. You're looking for those enemies to kind of follow you in. So as enemies come towards you, the enemies get closer and closer together and they pull together like that. So that's kind of how you kind of tank ad pulls and focus in on dealing with multiple enemies at the same time.